This week's lecture is in two parts. Part two, the part after this one, talks about how New York, LA, and Chicago, the country's three largest cities, have been depicted in hit movies from 1910 to 2012. In that discussion, we'll be putting forward a particular theory of culture, which implies that the culture, in this case the hit movies, that we get, is at least partly related to how people think about and view the item, here those cities. The argument is that overall a movie about a particular city becomes a hit not mainly because it's, for example, imposed on people via a marketing blitz, although for sure that sometimes happens, but because it resonates with the way people already think about that city. At any rate, because we're implying in part two theories about culture, we thought it would be helpful to lay out some theories of culture in part one to give you some context. So that's what this part of the lecture is doing. So let's talk about cultural theory. And first of all, we of course want to define culture, which isn't quite straightforward. There are three main ways that people often use the term culture, ranging from the narrowest to the broadest. The narrowest sense, which is the sense that we prefer here, uses culture as a synonym for the arts. For example, it's film or music or architecture or art and so on. There's a broader sense too, that also includes as culture political beliefs, social attitudes, and religious beliefs. So culture, in sense two, is basically all the belief systems in a society. And there's a third sense that you'll come across sometimes when people use the term culture, which is the broadest of all. And in that sense, culture is a synonym for basically a society with everything that that society contains. As I said, we prefer the narrower sense of culture, and that's the definition we're going to be using here. So that, for example, when we talk about culture, we mean literature, we mean music, movies, radio programs, TV programs, architecture, in other words, the arts. We're now going to move on and talk about a very important set of topics in cultural theory, and that's the distinction between popular culture and high culture, which really dominated a lot of the debates about culture for a long time. When people were using the popular culture, high culture distinction, which they were, as we said, for a long time, a lot of the debates about culture revolved around popular culture and high culture, and which was better and which was more worthy, and so on and so forth. But let's begin by talking about the distinction. So, for example, in literature, people would say, well, high culture is Shakespeare, and it's Charles Dickens, and it's John Steinbeck, and it's the New York Times, and the LA Times, and popular culture is John Grisham and Mary Higgins Clark, and the National Enquirer, and so on. So that's the way they used the distinction when it came to literature. When it came to film, they would also make the distinction. High culture would typically be the foreign films made by great foreign directors like François Truffaut or Werner Herzog, the great German director, or Hitchcock, the great English director. Popular culture, on the other hand, would be basically the products of Hollywood. Popular culture. In the realm of music, the distinction was made between high culture and popular culture. So high culture would be, for example, classical music. Popular culture would be folk music, rock music, heavy metal, rap, and so on. And finally, in the realm of art, just to give you another example, high culture would be the great artists, Rembrandt, Monet, Picasso. Now here it gets a bit complicated. Jackson Pollock is probably considered high culture. Andy Warhol and Klaus Oldenburg are probably considered high culture. We'll discuss that in a while. Popular culture would be the works of the sports artist Leroy Neiman, or store-bought inexpensive landscapes, or religious iconography. That would all be popular culture. You can see that it can get a bit complicated, and we'll talk about that in a while. So, for example, Andy Warhol, his work is definitely considered high culture, but you might ask why. Here's Marilyn Monroe. And again, Klaus Oldenburg, here's his cheeseburger. You see this in the great museums, and it's considered high culture, but you might wonder why, and we'll discuss that in a moment. Now, as I said, a lot of the debates of a culture revolved around this distinction, implicitly or explicitly, between popular and high culture, and the debates went in 4 stages. The first stage, which was popular in the 1940s and 50s, basically took the view that popular culture is pretty worthless. Not only is it worthless, but it's probably even harmful for people who expose themselves to it, whereas high culture is wonderful and terrific. A set of theorists who put forward this view, often called the Frankfurt School of Sociologists, basically argued that culture involves the domination of the masses by large corporations, which basically produce movies, Hollywood, for example, and then have huge advertising budgets to force us to go and see them. That would be an example of the view that popular culture is basically imposed upon us and is harmful. When Elvis Presley first came along, again, he was viewed by many people, cultural critics, as an example of harmful popular culture. Now, the second stage in the popular culture, high culture debate was really pioneered by sociologists, for example, the great sociologist Herbert Gans. And they said, look, wait a bit, maybe popular culture isn't so bad after all. They went out and actually studied culture. And they said, hey, look, it's not that bad. They still thought that high culture was better, but they argued it wasn't that bad. So Herbert Gans went to study a quote-unquote slum in Boston, the West End of Boston, just before it was supposed to be knocked down, and was knocked down to make way for modern buildings. And he said, look, there's a working class lifestyle going on there. There's social life. People support each other. There's some rather valuable stuff there. I mean, he agreed that maybe it should be knocked down, but he said, look, it's not worthless. It's definitely not worthless. Stage 3 in the debate about popular versus high culture is really quite radical. You can understand it when you look at it in the context of stages 1 to 2. It argued basically popular culture is in some ways superior to high culture. In some ways it's better. A classic book that argues this is the book by the great architects Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown called Learning from Las Vegas. And what they did is they went to the Vegas Strip and they looked at the architecture, which most architects in those days would have thought was pretty crass. And they said, look, this is really quite interesting. And they even said it's as interesting as the medieval cathedral and rather similar, because they said what's going on here is that the buildings are designed so you can see from the outside, and especially from driving past them, what goes on inside those buildings. So at the Luxor Casino, you see from going past it, and you can see from a long way away, it's a casino in the style of Egypt. And they said, look, modern architects are building glass steel boxes. They're really in some ways not as interesting. You can't tell from those boxes, those glass and steel towers, what's going on. In some ways, the Vegas Strip is more interesting. And as I said, they compared it to the medieval cathedral, which they said, look, is a building that you can tell from a long way away what's going on there. It's a house of worship. And so this was the argument, that maybe some things in popular culture are superior to high culture. And then the fourth stage in the debate, represented by a book, for example, by David Halley, Inside Culture, argues that really in the end, when all is said and done, and especially these days, it's not that easy to make a distinction between popular culture and high culture. It's not that easy to put things in a box and say, well, this kind of art is liked by the masses and that kind of art is liked by elite people, or this kind of music is engaged in by the masses and this kind of music is engaged in by elite people. Maybe this distinction isn't very useful after all. Maybe things are more blurry. And I think that in some ways is where the current debate stands. Now finally, in terms of looking at the history of cultural theory, we should look at theories that link culture to power. A lot of theories in the past tried to do that, and they argued that really the most interesting way to look at culture was to see how it was exerting power over people. And there were 3 major ways that people argued that was done. And the first way was what I've already referred to as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School argued that, culture is part of capitalism, that basically mass culture is produced by capitalist organizations, and what they do is they produce it, and then they go out and hire advertising agencies to brainwash us into buying their products. It's a very simple theory, but it was believed by a lot of people. It does have some strengths. Clearly, corporations, after they've made products, do often spend a lot of money advertising budgets trying to get us to buy their products. But people have decided this theory has some problems with it. It's a very mechanical theory. It assumes that people just mechanically react to and absorb culture. And it also assumes that cultural products only have one meaning. It's too simple. And another theory that looked at culture in terms of status and power, related culture to power, was theories that looked at culture as being all about status. And they argued that when people choose cultural items, what they're trying to do is they're trying to impress others. They're trying to gain status in the eyes of people, and that's why they choose cultural products. All these theories are trying to explain why certain cultural products are popular and get chosen. The strength of this theory is that it does seem plausible. The weakness of the theory is that people, when you ask them why they went to a particular movie or like a particular kind of music, they rarely say that it's because of status, which is a problem for the theory. And then there's a final theory about that links culture to power, which was quite popular in the last 15 years, and that's what's called the cultural capital theory. And that's a little bit complicated, but basically what that theory says is the following. It says there is high culture, there's something we can call high culture, classical music and great art and all that. And it argues that in order to appreciate that high culture, you need a lot of training. You either need to have come from a cultured family, or you need to have got a lot of education. And so they argue the working class typically they don't have that, and so they can't really understand and appreciate high culture. That's stage one. And stage two, they say, is that the dominant class then uses high culture to exclude the working class from jobs and to increase its own solidarity. So that, for example, if you go for an interview at a law firm, you want a job at a law firm, you've gone through law school, at some point during the interview, this theory suggests the interviewer will subtly start introduce, for example, music or art, and talk about maybe classical music or art, or talk about a book they've read recently, or a great book. And if you, the interviewee, can't talk knowledgeably about high culture, the argument goes, they're not going to hire you. But this theory suggests that culture is being used by the dominant class to exclude people whom it doesn't want. What are the strengths and weaknesses of cultural capital? Well, the strength is that it does seem like you need a lot of background to understand high culture. But the weakness is that a lot of modern high culture isn't popular even amongst the dominant class. So, for example, a lot of the dominant class don't spend a lot of time listening to classical music or going to the opera and so on. And so, how can high culture be used as a theory to exclude people if a lot of the dominant class don't even pay much attention to it? So this theory is also problematic. Anyway, basically, what you need to take away from this is that these days, we don't necessarily assume that culture is imposed on people, and that's particularly true when it comes to looking at hit movies. We're going to argue that the hit movies about New York, LA, and Chicago are probably, a lot of them are hits because they somehow resonate with people. People feel that this is an appropriate representation of the cities at issue. And also, we're not sure that there's a big distinction to be made between high culture and popular culture. So we're not sure that some movies about cities are just looked at by the elite, and other movies are just looked at by the masses. We don't think that distinction really makes any sense. Anyway, you should now turn to part B of this lecture.